Starting the stream. Okay. Looks like I am live. Cool. So, without any further ado, I might as well just crack on. So, let me make sure I've got the right kind of title for my stream. I hope I don't make any mistakes like I did yesterday. My channel. I have 6 followers. That's not bad. It's a good start. Let's see. Let's refresh the page. I'm just trying to change the what it says. Giving writers feedback on their stories. Yep, there we go. And it's got writing, English in real life. And I'm on the just chatting room. There we go. Alright, we're all good there. Good stuff. Cool. So, you guys can see that, right? Let's crack on. Let's give some writers some feedback on their work. So here we have Jackie Aqua. Hey, I'm writing a tower climb lit RPG called The Salamanders on Royal Road. Here's the synopsis. If you're interested, come check it out. Feedback is always welcome. Cool. Royal Road. 2 years ago, except. Let's have a go. Essence path discovered. Skill essence sight obtained. Alchemist class obtained. Alchemist level 1. Skill infusion obtained. Skill basic alchemy obtained. So this is like a light novel, right? Mika woke up to those words when he was 11 and a half, and his world had become a different place. At first he thought he must still be dreaming, or that he had something in his eye. His walls seemed to be glowing. He rubbed the sleep out of them as he sat up and called over his shoulder, "Mum." His wall was definitely glowing, or rather, a thin sheen of light covering it was. It reminded him of shadow plates, actually. The ones his nana always made, but inverted. Instead of figures in black, there was distortions in the light, in the patterns of tree bark. Mika wanted to touch it, or Micah. He threw his blanket back and ran over to do just that. His skin tingled with anticipation as he placed his hand on the wood, but nothing happened. The wood felt the same. The light didn't even react. Stubbornly, Micah tried dragging a finger over a ridged line instead, hoping for some kind of reaction. He thought he saw it drag along for a bit under his skin, but then it snapped back into place and moved along. Wait, what? Mika frowned and took a step back. Was his wall crawling? The bark sheen was moving ever so slowly, straining, bloating, merging again as if the wood was still growing, but everyone knew bark was dead. Micah looked up and saw the sheen stretched even to the ceiling and all over the wooden things in his room. Here and there he even found distortions in the shape of leaves. Also, whilst I'm doing this, I forgot to put my Twitch overlay on, so I could be missing comments. Let me just put a little test message in. Test. Cool. Alright, so I've got that. And back to it. The bark sheen was moving. Done that. He definitely wanted to touch those. He huffed and puffed as he jumped and stretched all the way to his fingertips. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't reach them. After a short break, Mika scowled in frustration. He knew he was going to have his growth spurt soon, and then he would be super tall and be able to reach anything. But in the meantime, he climbed his windowsill, squinted his eyes a bit against the morning sun, and he stared at his windows. They looked different too. The morning light revealed faint patterns inside the glass. They weren't quite like pictures, but they reminded Mika of the stained glass windows he saw around the city anyway. He leaned closer to get a better look, and the patterns shifted all the sudden. Some jumped from place to place, others folded in on themselves. They all rotated to spawn whole new fractures. It was mesmerizing. Having an idea, Micah spun around to check if the patterns were thrown on his floor as well, like shadows. Instead, he found the sunlight waving like invisible strands of glass around his own shadow. He crawled back down in awe and tried to trace them, but they actually moved this time with each of his own movements. It was funny trying to catch them. Eventually, he managed by using one hand to catch the light of the other. It ran away then, seemingly affronted. By the time his mother came around his room, Mika was jumping on his bed, or rather on his pillow on his bed, and laughing. Whenever he did, phantom feathers shot up out of the case and drifted into the air when they fell down again. He was having fun pushing them around like dandelion seeds. "What are you doing, Micah?" she asked. "Mum, look," he said and pointed. "The feathers." She smiled, seemingly bemused, but she didn't look. She was too busy putting on her council pin and headed downstairs. "Hurry up or you're going to be late," she called back. Late? Right. Class. Mika had totally forgotten about it. But did he have to go? Wait, no. He wanted to go. Outside there were bound to be even more funny patterns. He scampered over to his bedroom door and sped downstairs, off to wolf down his food at the breakfast table. His dad watched him with a single raised eyebrow. "Hungry?" he asked. Alright. So I'm done by that point. By the hungry line. That's about as much as I want to read. Because a lot of this is like, this is such a mixed bag, because it actually is quite well written in like a very functional, what do you call it? Like, let me show you. So this is like this is of its type of genre. So if you're a fan of like video game mechanics and that type of stuff in a story, then this is fine. I wouldn't criticize that too much, because it's like, it's part of the fun. My problem is I understand that I might not be like the most attentive reader sometimes, but I really am struggling to sort of picture the world that he's creating. Because it says, Mika woke up to those words when he was 11 and a half and his world had become a different place. Alright, so we don't know what his world is, but it'd become a different place. So I expect everything that comes after this for a little while, to tell me exactly the difference. At first he thought he still must be dreaming. Here we got the same old issue of people waking up at the start of chapters, which is a terrible thing, happens way too often. Or he had something in his walls seemed to be glowing. He rubbed the sleep out of them as he sat up and called over his shoulder. So already I'm confused, because I know this is some kind of fantasy, but are we in a modern setting or are we in a fantastical setting from the beginning? Mum, American use of the word mum, but it might not be. You're not sure about that? His wall was definitely glowing. Again, I don't know anything about the wall beyond that it's glowing, so I don't have anything to contrast it with, other than the boy's reaction that it is glowing, and that's unusual apparently. That his nana always made but inverted. Instead of figures in black, there were distortions in the light. Like, that's fine. Like the writing is fine in terms of like he huffed and puffed as he jumped and stretched all the way to his fingertips. Like, I like the detail in a functional way. Which, when I'm saying functional, I mean like it's well written to the point where I would read this story at this level of writing, probably. This is a nice level of professionalism in the writing. My problem is that the author seems to assume that I already have prerequisite knowledge of the room, this character, and there's way too many things being omitted early on, that by the time I get to Hungry and we're moving on from this initial opening into this like this conversation he's having with his dad. I'm still trying to figure out what the hell is even going on. Like, so like, but like, again, I'm not trying to be like a charitable reader, because I'm basically giving my opinion of, if I was reading this, where would I honestly probably say, no, this isn't for me. And it's by this line, hungry. And it's not specifically because this line is really bad or anything. It's just that everything before this line where he says his dad watched him with a raised eyebrow is of the same opening. And I like it. It flows quite nicely. There's some nice imagery. That's all fine. But the underlying problem is that it's all parts and not part of a whole. So it's just too confusing and too vague is the issue here. So that's my sort of what I think the author needs to fix if I were them, is make sure that you don't take how much the reader understands for granted before you start going into like conversations between characters. And like the reason this is important is because what I've read here basically tells me the kind of story that I'm gonna get. Fair enough if you intend to like explain everything more as we go, right? But the main problem with that sort of thinking is that, to me, it shows an amateur level of writing, because it's like I basically, to move beyond this point, I have to be like, okay, I'm not going to enjoy this story the way I would like a professional novel, and I sort of have to downgrade my opinion of the story to keep, and so I'd have to really like the concept to keep going, because this is like basically a fairly generic opening for this kind of story. And it's like, well, if you can't open your story professionally, confidently, in a way that's really enticing, then I'm really not interested about any kind of larger than life fantastical events that come later in the story, because you should hook me from the first sentence onward. That sounds kind of like, a really tough standard, but basically if you want to tell a really strong story and get people hooked, that is basically the standard we all have to live up to. So that's my thoughts. I think it's decent. I'm sure if I read on, like there's a lot of potential here, but I feel like this is one of those stories that would build more as it went along. But it's definitely in the amateur category, but high amateur, not low amateur. So there's a lot good to it. I think they've done I can obviously tell that there's a lot of really good thought that went into this, and word choice and all that. So I'm very optimistic that this writer's going to make some really good stuff. They just need to keep at it, basically, and keep improving, and make sure that they understand that as much as writing is good to be enjoyed for one's own enjoyment, you need to make sure at all times the reader is not confused, unless you specifically want it to be the case, but it doesn't read like this in this instance. You want to make sure you immediately get rid of as much confusion as possible, so the reader can engage and emotionally attach themselves to the scenario. Okay, so what was this one called? The Salamanders, and that I finished this one at 14 minutes in. The Salamanders. 14 minutes. I published She Courts Darkness. Here's the last chapter of my debut novel, The Scribble. I feel like I got impatient and just devoted to silliness. I ignored this one yesterday, but I'll give it a try today. It started off as a scribble when Devon was 4 years old. There was something remarkably sentimental about him the moment he was sketched. The greatest artist among you could not replicate what was the perfect stick man. Etched from blue crayon, he smiled back at Devon like a memory older than the little boy himself. His minuscule limbs and torso were horribly mangled and they didn't have ears, but he looked content, and he was content, proudly displayed on the kindergarten wall. More eyes rested on this misshapen doodle than anything else Devon would ever create. But what should we call him? The teacher asked. Devon averted his gaze to the chalkboard, where the sacred letter of the day stood proudly, H. H was for Hoop, or Humpty Dumpty, or Humphrey. Whereas Devon's full name sat dejected at the bottom of a piece of navy blue construction paper the work was carefully glued to, Humphrey, yes in quotation marks, was marked precisely in cursive writing in the top left corner. Though there was nothing remotely remarkable about him, and there was something vaguely concerning for Devon's potential development, that he thought Humphrey was worth placing next to the corner paper sunsets that more talented youngsters were now capable of sketching. This sense of sentimentality shockingly made its mark on the parents at the art show. Simply put, there was something perfect in what it represented. A poorly trained puppy, a sapling about to tip over, lest the stake pull it up. Certainly not verbally, but in terms of seconds per eyeball, he won out over his peers, and Humphrey was very pleased. Humphrey was a simple stick man. He knew he was a bastion of nostalgia to his audience and not as complex as the competition, but Humphrey was happy to be a little stick man. He was good at being what he was, and nothing more. As the artist gazed upon his work with glimmering, innocent eyes, Humphrey realised something about himself and about Devon. They were better off if they remained what they were. Humphrey didn't have to be a shimmering sunset at the edge of his dimension, and Devon didn't have to be a real artist, but together they had carved out the perfect niche, and anything different could sacrifice what they had accomplished together. To Humphrey's chagrin, he wielded his power over the boy, much as he tried. When the time came that he and his friends were to be replaced with tiny, palmless hand paintings, the teacher peeled away the navy blue construction paper down from the wall and placed him in a large envelope of Humphrey's art portfolio. Humphrey wanted to talk to the collage of marine stickers and the stallion which Devon needed help to barely trace out to the page in dull lead, but they didn't seem to share his perspective. The stallion in particular just about convinced Humphrey otherwise. Now I am a gorgeous thing, I am, he neighed. Cool. That's as much as I cared to read of this. I think that for what it is, it's okay. I was very lost in the beginning. I was basically lost until Humphrey was a simple stick man. Until that point, I was basically like, I have no idea what's going on, really. Which is okay to a certain degree, but I had to put in a bit of effort to really get to that point. Humphrey was a simple stick man. He knew he was a bastion of nostalgia to his audience, as not as complex as the competition. Like, it's a weird thing because on one level it's like, I feel like the author's putting in a lot of their thoughts and feelings and memories and stuff into this work, which works. I like it. And that's the reason I kept reading on as far as I did. Let me turn down this music, it's getting a bit loud for me. There's two options for this music right now, it seems. Loud or not at all. Does this work? There we go. Humphrey was a simple stick man. No, I don't think that changed the sound of the music at all. Let me see. If I take this. There we go, it's better. 1 second, my dog wants to come in the room. Okay. You know what? Let's read on just a little bit more. Let's see if I can get into it a little bit more. Now I'm a gorgeous thing I am, he neighed. But some years down the line, if he decides this horse or that horse is worth drawing, then who would I be to prevent him? But how can you exist and not be confident that you are the best version of yourself? It is necessary, isn't it? Who says I'm not? He snorted. I will still be here. He may sketch or draw or paint another horse, but I will always be here. Yes, for the longest time, Humphrey was indeed convinced. Devon could and would go on to mix and change, but who was to say that he improved? He was still the best of what he was, and no one could take that away. For 2 long years, Humphrey existed on his little square of paper, glued to the larger square of navy blue construction paper. He existed as the sole non-white exception to the stack of basic math problems and paragraphs that he eventually supported. He made content conversation with the stallion and the collage and the masses of vertical and horizontal lines which made up these new math problems. They argued deep into the night about the solution to the riddle posed by the witty teacher. If no single man crossed home plate, but the baseball team still emerged victorious, then they must all be married. What did it mean? Humphrey hardly noticed the years flying by like gallons of juice in juice boxes, in lunch boxes. He didn't notice that he had been shoved away in a drawer somewhere. He didn't notice or acknowledge that everything around him changed, even if he willed himself to remain the same. One fateful day before which nothing notable had occurred for a rather vast amount of time, which became impossible to estimate when one has been shut away in a stack of paper for much of it, Humphrey was plucked from his discussion parlour and plopped into reality. When he saw what he saw, he could not recognise a revolting display, intended to be a revolting display. Clothed in black, his hair dyed ash black, a shark bone piercing his earlobe, his now skeletal looking. What happened? What had happened? And more than anything, Humphrey wanted back in the drawer. This wasn't happening. This was not the case. First impressions do not merely mislead, but create the impression that the worst possible thing is the initial interaction. Devon, sobbing profusely, created angry diagonal strikes through both of Humphrey's cheeks. At long last, elephant ears and wig-looking hair were next. Wig-looking hair was next. Unspeakable things were jotted in speech bubbles as far as Humphrey could see. A very edgy tank top, watery eyes, and the finishing touch, a pistol which Humphrey's hand was forced into grasping, in suspended animation pointed in his direction for all of time, or that's how it seemed. With that, his navy blue construction paper and the smaller square glued to it were crumped into a ball and just about discarded. The moment before his fate was sealed, though, Devon reluctantly crumpled his past and sobbed into it. I hate you, I hate you, I hate you. From what lasted as long as the time in the drawer, Devon held his most awkward of positions. His tears fluttered onto the paper, making it extremely inflexible. A single misguided judgment, and that paper rips, and it did rip. At his elbow rested upon the picture, Devon jolted back unpredictably and tore off Humphrey's right leg. His sobbing became more and more disturbingly extreme, and Humphrey was pinned there for every second of it. Devon's hatred swiftly turned to remorse. His crying became more drawn out, but his tears slowly faded. I'm sorry. Why are you all I've got? Oh God, this back and forth between depression and insanity persisted. Okay, I don't even know what's going to keep going with this, but I do like it. It's hard to say. It's like I'm into the poetic nature of the story, I guess, about the change, and it's kind of like a picture version of Toy Story with like added depression into it and stuff. So there's some interesting aspects to it, but it's not really like a story. It's almost like I don't know how to describe it. It's like it's a mix of things. It's not quite like a poem. It's not quite like a, I don't know, like in a way it almost reads like, in an essay when like an essayist is trying to like make a point, but they make a point through story. So like I'm not engaged with the story in terms of caring about Humphrey or Devon because I don't know them really. And so all I've really got is like trying to unravel this metaphor that's sort of taking place. And it's engaging enough for what it is, but it's not personally something I would read for like enjoyment. But because I think the issue is like Humphrey can't really do anything. It's kind of a stupefying thing because like I kind of want to just keep reading, which is odd, to like try and figure out what the hell's going on with this. Like with this, like for one thing I know for sure is like the back and forth between depression and insanity persisted. This is like too far of a jump for me. That's like I both want to read on, but I also don't because the author kind of jumped the shark here, where it's like, whoa, depression and insanity. Like, okay, you're telling me this, but it kind of doesn't feel warranted. Like for instance, you've got Humphrey spending all this time in a drawer, right? As a piece of paper. Now, to me, if he's experiencing time in like real time, then that's like extremely hellish and, you know, like the insanity of a drawing. And the world you create by doing that is like this hellish world where like all drawings have personalities and shit, which is interesting, but it's also like incredibly nightmarish. But it's like I can't get situated with Humphrey as a character because I feel like he might just be, you know, forgotten about in the next paragraph. So I don't want to give my focus and attention to him as a character in the story. I don't want to situate myself with him. But then at the same time, I can't situate myself with Devon because he's absent. And then when he turns up again, it's like, well, now I'm leaving Humphrey as a character and I'm going with Devon. Though, to be fair, you could say they're both like psychologically linked. You know, like they're two sides, like they're aspects of the same psychological character in the story, but they're just two separate characters. I guess it's just a bit of a jumble overall. Like, I think probably what I like about it overall is that the writer themselves is thinking and has some interesting things and thoughts, but the problem is it's not put together in a coherent way, where I feel like the writer is just kind of like putting everything on the page, stream of consciousness, and they're not really focused on making sure like information's delivered in the right order at the right time to make sure that me as the reader, I'm not getting overwhelmed by details and asides. I think, yeah, that's one of the other major things is that there's so many asides where it's, you know, like we just introduced to Humphrey and then the next thing you know, we're introduced to this horse and then we're given like, you know, this like pontification about like art and what, you know, is art being good enough as it is, as in basic or better and all this kind of stuff. So I think there's potential here, but I think it just suffers from being... I just don't really think this was planned out and it was a stream of consciousness kind of writing, and that can be okay in some circumstances, I guess, but for me right now it's like, I'm sure it's like is more interesting to stream. It's one of those stories where it's more interesting to write for your own personal edification than it is for a reader who doesn't see exactly what you're trying to put onto the page. But I will say there's a lot good to this. Just I think it needs editing. I think you could cut away like 10% of all the words here, maybe even 20%. Like trim it down, streamline it, just give it more structure basically, because the writing is, you know, like it's an easy read, which is nice. But stuff like this, like, oh god, I don't like that, because it's like you haven't earned that. I'm not situated with a character who's, you know, am I situated with Devon or Humphrey? So it's like it's like So then the vaguity of like, oh god, like who's really saying that? Even though it'd be obvious to the author, it's really not really obvious to the reader. And then stuff like I'm sorry, why are you all that I've got? Not a bad line, but this I'm sorry is like, you know, a bit of a waste of words. I think it would be more concise with this, you know. Devon's hatred swiftly turned to remorse. It's like, okay, I feel like you're going somewhere, which is interesting, but it's like, I don't know Devon, so I don't care about his hatred, and I don't care that it swiftly turned to remorse. And it's like, can you show me why it turned into remorse better, in a more clear way? Because it's just too vague, which happens to be like the number one issue of most writing I seem to be looking at. But overall, obviously you can tell by the length of time I've spent talking about it, I like it. And I think maybe just with like a different story topic, or like, you know, with a different idea, it might just be this specific story where they're kind of unfocused. But like the coming of age themes and vibes to this is nice, but again, this reads like a first draft that's been like partially edited and isn't nearly close to being like a professional level. You know, that this is still in like amateur territory. And I'd say the difference between amateur and professional would be, with a professional, you feel at all times that whatever you're reading on the page has been carefully considered and is exactly what you need to be reading at that time. Right now, this is all filled with word bloat, basically. Even though it's not badly written, it's just lots of words and bloat, and it's just a bit all over the place. But there's enough good here that makes me want to talk about it for a little while. So yeah, that's my thoughts on that one. And this one's called, is it The Scribble? I think it's The Scribble. The Scribble. So it's horror-ish. Yeah, I wouldn't really call it like horror personally. Maybe that becomes horror, but I personally found it to be more of like a navel-gazing psychological story, which is fine, but it's definitely not what I would consider like an engaging horror read. It's more like weird fiction with like a slight touch of, I don't know what you call it. It's like coming of age angst. But the part of the reasons, like, you could argue, as you read on, there's going to be more to like discover and find interesting about the story, and it'll become more of a horror. But the problem is like, that was as far as I was. And I even went further than I usually probably would. That was as far as I was willing to read before you lost me as a reader. So it doesn't matter what else you had coming in the story, because what came before wasn't interesting or engaging or well written enough to make me do that, for all the reasons I've mentioned. But still, pretty good. Okay, let's move on to the next one. The Whisperer Pride will be the death of you. I don't know which one to choose. An assassin goes to avenge her brother's death. Sounds cool. The Whisperer by Daniel. Just check the stream's working. There we go. That bottom bit's like a little bit cut off. There we go. Let's zoom in a little bit. The Whisperer by Daniel. The old elf sat on a throne made of fine crimson leather, while scrimmaging through business ledgers against a warm open fire. He sat at the end of a short hall with tall walls and long elegant windows stretching high into the sky, overlooking Alroma, the city of swords below. His long silk white robe almost blended with his pale white, nearly translucent skin. His white hair now turning grey, but his dark soul stood out. Okay. The blaze within the hearth cast his long, hunched, slender shadow across the room to the base of a guard by the entrance door. A young, well-built man wielding a wooden, steel-tipped spear in his hand. He stood tall and proud, yet oblivious to the Whisperer, crouching just outside the window, clad in all black, with a dagger craving blood. A blue parrot sat on the old elf's desk, squawking restlessly as the elf grabbed a quill and began writing on a paper. Death, 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 the bird chanted. Its crying was loud enough for the assassin to silently open the window and jump into the hall. The room smelled of lavender, strong and pungent, so that to mask the scent of the old elf's smoking pipe. He let out a loud cough as he handed the bird the rolled-up letter. The bird flew out an open window as the Whisperer's blade flew from its scabbard and effortlessly sliced the young man's throat. Blood splattered on the long shadow as she let the body fall. "I heard whispers of your coming," said the old man, staring into the hearth, now facing away from her. The Whisperer ignored him and stuck the long spear through the two handles of the large acacia doors, locking it. She wiped her blade on the man's steel chest and stood facing the old elf. "You best get along with it. I just sent news of my demise." His voice was calm, now a tint of fear in it. This isn't fair, the girl thought. She wanted him to be terrified, the same way her brother was 7 years ago when he ordered his men to slit his throat. "I told you pride would be the death of him," he had told her just after, with a sly, rotten smile on his face. She wanted him to beg and cry just as she did as she was forced to watch. She wanted him to suffer. "You're not a very good assassin, are you?" he said, turning his seat around to confront his killer. His voice was calm, yet his eyes were tense. His thin lips quivered on his gaunt, bony face. She stood still facing him, a simple slice to the throat, cut off a limb and watch him bleed, break his arms and throw him off his tower, slice his stomach and strangle him with his guts. She wanted him to suffer badly. The assassin calmly stepped forward until she stood opposing the man. He never flinched, only watched her near in a sense of relief. He looked up at her with a stern face yet desperate eyes. "Do it." Her eyes were drawn towards the business ledgers on the desk. He had transferred all his money to his sons and sold his business to his brother. He was left with nothing. In his final moments of life was when he decided to be selfless and humble. How pathetic. The door behind her began to slam. The guards were trying to come in. The old elf tensed at the sound. "Do it. Kill me," he demanded, his voice quivering yet strong. But he was not afraid of death. The guards would come and save him, forcing him to live a life of poverty only a memory of his greatness. His brother and sons won't help him. They saw past his kind and charming persona and knew of his cruel, evil soul. He would live the rest of his life on the streets, begging for money just like the people he would ignore and taunt every day. He would live with bastards and whores, eating through the trash that he would throw at them for entertainment. He wouldn't wear lavish silk gowns, but rather torn, ragged clothes made of old sacks of food. His pale skin would turn sallow with dirt and filth. His hair would become long and mangy, growing thick and tangled as he would use it as a pillow to rest. Just knocked over my microphone. Very clever. His pale skin, his hair would become long and mangy, growing thick and tangled as he would use it as a pillow to rest his head every night. He would have to sleep with a dagger under his chest in fear of the guards who would catch him sleeping behind abandoned buildings and inns he once owned. He would die forgotten and ignored. That was the fear in his eyes. "Do it already," he said, grabbing the girl's arm. She smacked his bony hand off and kicked his chair back, toppling it over. The old Frau elf fell to the ground and cried in pain as he tried to reach for his back. "Good." The guards continued slamming on the door, but the spear held strong. Are you Craven? Asked the elf. Craven, like your brother, you bitch. The girl drew out her blade and placed it against her brother's killer's throat. The elf closed his eyes and his mouth curved upwards slightly. No, this isn't right. The guard shouted into the room and slammed against the doors once more, splintering the spear. Just do it already, please, begged the old elf, a tear rolling down his cheek. The door was slammed again and the spear began to crack. One more hit and they would be through. This is what he wants. A tear rolled down the girl's face as she placed the dagger upon the old elf's chest. No, he cried, no, please, I'm begging you. The girl turned to the open window just before jumping out. She turned and looked down to the man who killed her brother and whispered, your pride will be the death of you, and left. Okay, the end. My thoughts. I like it. I think it's nicely written. Functional. The prose isn't that great, but it's like, for what it is, it gets the story across. I think one of the key weaknesses of the story is so much of the context is given in a very uninteresting way. So like, you have a character whose brother was murdered, right? And she had to witness it. So for me, I think that's if you know that scene's happened, and that's like a prerequisite to this scene, then I think you don't necessarily have to write that scene, but you already have a scene in your story that you know is going to be really dramatic and a tough read for your readers. And I personally think you should write that scene and include it in this story. And you can take pieces of it and litter it throughout. But I think just referencing it is a very lazy way of writing. I don't know if you're trying to keep to a short word count or if this is just however long you wanted this to be. But you just have a really interesting scene about the elf being an arsehole and murdering someone, and we don't really know why. And I would like to know why, and I don't know if this is meant to be the beginning of a larger story, if it's just its own small thing. Part of the other problem is the assassin character. Obviously, there's something to do with her brother's died, so she's taken the time to become an assassin. But obviously, I have no information about that, and I don't even know much. All I know is that she is an assassin. Her brother was murdered, and now she's come to kill this elf. That's cool, but there's not enough details there for me to be interested in that character, because it's a very, very, very generic backstory. Also, the fact that she's a woman is it's just something to consider in terms of explanation. It's typically men are the killers, and I don't have a problem with the woman being the assassin being a woman, but I just think it's an opportunity to explore a woman assassin and how would she differ from a man in the way that she does her job, if at all. And I just think it's just something that is an interesting narrative aspect that I personally would explore, because I'm interested to know if this is a world where female assassins are a thing all the time, or is she an exception to the rule? And if so, what makes her so special? If not, why is it that this world has so many female assassins? I just have a lot of questions, and I think that by not even acknowledging it, or maybe you just didn't think of it, I'm not sure, but it's it makes me less interested in the story, because you as an author, you're not exploring your world and the ideas and the themes and the characters in a way where I think, right, this is a story I want to keep reading, because they just really lavishly go over those type of things. Instead, the basicness of the story just keeps it in a generic setting and world. It's kind of I imagine this kind of a World of Warcraft type world, or I don't even know, some kind of Skyrim type situation. So it's not bad, but it's also not unique to you as the author in a way that makes it like a compelling read. Like basically, if someone was going to do like a knockoff version of this story, it wouldn't be very hard, because there's nothing really unique about this story to make it unique. 1 second, just grab some water. I think the pivotal flaw of this story is that it centers upon the idea that she doesn't kill the guy, the old elf, because the fate worse than death is that he's given away, like he's a King Lear type situation where he's given away all his power and now he's vulnerable. But it's like you're showing me probably like the least interesting part of the story, because I would love to see a story about like an old evil elf, or at least like a longer story where, you know, you show his descent as his, you know, his nephews or whatever, like his family members that he gave away his power to, they sort of like turn their back on him and he's slowly descending into poverty, and you don't feel too bad for him because it's like he's such a bad person. And I just think that would be really interesting. But the way you describe it, it's like, how does this character know all this? Like, she figures it out by like reading the papers on the desk or something. But it's like, okay, but wouldn't it be way more interesting to be in the moment and explore that with the character as he's like realizing how screwed he is? And like the fact that she's able to discern all that immediately is like just a bit unbelievable. And the conversation that they have is really boring because it's barely a conversation. And so them two confronting each other in this way is just kind of like uninteresting, because it's like he doesn't care about her. She really wants him dead. And I guess I also don't believe that she would go to all this effort to become an assassin. Or, you know, maybe she already was one, I don't know. Again, I don't know, so I can't really have a context or reference for it. But the fact that she chooses not to kill him as like a fate worse than death type thing, it doesn't feel earned or justified in the story. And I think part of it is that you're trying to tell so much story within one scene, and your scene can't carry that weight. You know, you're trying to tell a story that should be about 4 or 5 scenes and lots more words, but your story here, you know, there's so much going on, but really nothing at all actually happens of any major interest. Like, I think the only pivotal thing that actually really happens, there's 2 things. The one is the elf gives away his power, and then the other one's the guard that has his throat slit. And, you know, one tells me that your story deals in a realm of, like, you know, death is on the line. So, you know, it's about life and death, and, you know, it's a cruel world where people get murdered even if they're just doing their job, right? So that's interesting. But then for her to kill someone really callously like that, and then to just leave someone else to, like, not to a fate worse than death, it seems like a weird turn of character. Like, if she'd come in and knocked out the guard, then I would understand more that she's more of a pacifist, and, you know, like, she's an assassin, but she doesn't kill unless she really needs to, you know. But instead of that, we instead get this sort of vague idea of this assassin, and there's just really no character there to, like, you know, she wants revenge. I think that's like the only main character trait that I can gain from her, and that's it. So I hope that helps, like, my insights into that. I think it kept me reading till the end because I was interested to see how it developed. I think the descriptions and everything of the world were basic and a bit vague. I think the only real imagery that I got was the elf sitting in his chair and she's coming in, kills the guard. Like, I get that, but if you're thinking of some kind of, like, really lavish interesting visual imagery. All I really was visualizing was the elf sat in a room. And so that wasn't a very like compelling, engaging staging of the scene, in my opinion. But overall, I think you did a pretty good job. So that's 50 minutes in, and this one's called The Whisperer. Whew, that's a lot. On the Road to Elspar, Book 1, Fantasy, roughly 340,000 words in progress. How daunting. Let's have a look. I think that one just looks weirdly complicated. Not my cup of tea. Comedy genres. Genre non-fiction, opid comedy. I basically stick to fiction. Hello fellow writers, I have a 52k novel, Dead Souls, and American Pie that I'd love to get feedback on. No. Afterlife short story. Word count still unfinished. As technology continues to improve, I've read some of these already. On the continent of Weridad, 5 people are hired to deliver a package. It soon becomes clear that the quest means so much more. As a large spike of ice whizzed over his head and impaled his hat on the wall above him, Fenris Redfeather reflected on his day. It had started like any other, looking for work. The gnomish gunslinger had seen a flyer advertising a job, high pay, so he took it. He, his wife, and a group of 3 others were to deliver a crate belonging to some rich person. It was a simple job, about a 14-day trip across the desert, with no real danger beyond the travel, and yet Fenris thought, if that were true, why were they being shot at? Fenris was shaken from his thoughts by a wave of fire cascading into him. Thankfully, the defensive shield the warding pin on his chest created protected him from most of the shot. His hat was not so fortunate. He took cover and analysed his surroundings. He was at the doorway to his small metal house, about the size of a carriage. It was on the outskirts of the city of Shine Spring, and was under fire from a group of 4 people taking cover on the other side of the street. As he always did in these situations, Fenris asked himself the questions, what are my options? And then it came to him. Lily, Fenris shouted over the blast to his wife inside. Can you start the engines? What? The halfling woman yelled back. Lily was an artificer, with hair as dark as the oil stains that covered her jumpsuit. I was about to test that thing I was telling you about. You know, the boots. Let's keep going. Not sure this is the time to try out an invention. Fenris pulled himself behind the doorway as a long metal spear flew past, skewering itself through the ceiling before quickly vanishing into aether. Fair enough, I'm going to need about 5 minutes though. Can you hold them off until then? Yep, hurry. Fenris stuck his head back outside and pulled out his spell shooter, a revolver covered in detailed runes that he normally wore on his hip. Just as Fenris was aiming, an invisible force crashed into him, vibrating with pure sound. Damn, a sonic shockwave. He'd taken a direct hit, and even his warding pin couldn't protect him from the shot's full effect. The constant thrumming drowned out Fenris's scream as his ears rang like a bell during an earthquake. As his body crashed into the soft sand just outside the door, a hand grabbed his arm, pulling him up. What's happening? The stunned gnome tried to look at who was holding him, but all he saw was a blur, then a needle in his arm. Ah, gods, what was that? Fenris felt his senses coming back. It's just a little stability elixir. I keep some in case of an emergency like this one. The blur dissipated, and Fenris saw a human woman sitting next to him, carrying a pouch with bottles. Oh, thanks, Dr. Williams. Fenris recognised this woman as a member of the group he and Lily were travelling with. Okay, so that's as much as I care to read. This kind of fantasy is not my cup of tea, personally. This kind of, like, World of Warcraft type, goblins, gnomes, it's more like Dungeons and Dragons, that kind of... Yeah, I feel like I'm kind of reading a story that's someone's Dungeons and Dragons roleplay session put into fiction. And that's not necessarily bad, but it's just not my cup of tea personally. I think my key issue here is that so much is happening and I don't care. And the main reason I don't care is because I don't really care about Fenris Redfeather as a character, and I don't care because he hasn't been set up in any kind of interesting way. We're in media res as he's like in this chaotic fight, but you haven't earned that as the writer of this story for me, because I don't care whether he lives or dies. And if there aren't any stakes to the fight, which I don't feel like there really is, because it's the beginning of the story, so he's not going to die, or there's a very, very low chance. I just don't get the impression, and I don't feel any kind of stakes there, and it kind of feels like, a movie where like characters are doing movie type stuff, like hold them off for 5 minutes, okay, I'll do my best. Like, I get all that, and in its own way it is kind of fun, but it's only really fun if you feel connected emotionally to the characters and their behaviour. Like the comedy aspect of it, for instance. Like, it's only really funny if you have a point of reference for the character. If a character acts kind of... Because like, you have to know the character to know when they're acting out of character or in line with their character. And right now, all I really know about Fenris is that I think he's a gnome. I could kind of tell the issue of the story from the first line, where it says, a large spike of ice whizzed over his head and the powder sat on the wall above him. Fenris Redfeather reflected on his day. Like, he reflected on his day, but like, he doesn't actually reflect on his day. He kind of just sums it up in a kind of, like you're reading it on the back of a book blurb, and it's like, you as the writer don't give a shit about about like how his day was, and you'll just want to jump straight into the action. And because you're doing that, it kind of makes me really uninterested. Because if your characters aren't interesting in their dull moments, where they're doing kind of boring stuff, but they're still like compelling to be around and hang out with, then when they get into exciting moments, they're still going to be equally as boring. It's very quirky and quaint, and it's not necessarily bad. Like, I could definitely see there being an audience for this. And the kind of action and stuff, it's a nice light read. And obviously I don't think you're trying to be Shakespeare with this, like you're kind of aware of the genre that you're writing and trying to have fun with it. I definitely appreciate that. And I would say it's not even badly written, like it's kind of concise and nice. But the problem is like, just overall, I'd say the only vaguely interesting aspect was there was some kind of mix of like gun technology, and like the world building was not as generic as your average Dungeons and Dragons campaign or whatever. Like there was some touches of like technology in there which I found kind of interesting, but by this point in the story, because the opening to stories are absolutely crucial, like I feel like you need to be more confident taking your time with the boring stuff. And when I say boring, like I mean more like the characters in their dull moments. If you can make that interesting, then you can really tell a great story. Like Stephen King, for better or worse, like he's a master of having characters seemingly, going about their day, or just about their lives, and as like the growing menace of the situation in his stories grows. But like he brings such a vivid sense of character into his stories, of like the Americana of it, and he does it so quickly and efficiently that by the time vampires turn up in Salem's Lot, or it turns up in It, the Killer Clown, like, by the time the monstrous entity turns up, we give a shit because we already feel a connection to the characters, and he's taken the time to give us that connection. If we don't have that emotional connection, all the exciting things in your story fall flat. To use a really generic example, like we sit with Luke Skywalker for a while, and he's, you know, just like living life on a farm, a moisture farm, and so like we need that to contrast against the exciting times when the stormtroopers are coming after him. But right now you've basically jumped immediately to the stormtroopers without any interesting backstory whatsoever, and that's my problem with it. But overall it's okay, it's fine. The level of writing's fine. I just think you tonally just need to focus on things that aren't the really cool actiony Marvel Cinematic Universe type action type stuff, is my advice, because I just don't care to read on with the story from this point. But it's a far cry away from being bad for sure. 101. Wanderers of Weredeed. Go to the next one. Escape the Thief. I kind of like don't want to give people who already have the book released feedback, because it's like, what's the point? They've already published it. A Drive to Remember. You do not get 3 wishes. Rain of Stones. How do I get rid of these? Is that it? No. There we go. Can you see that alright? It's not bad. View, zoom. Mode. Good enough. Okay. Oh wait, do I want to get rid of that? There we go. Chapter 1. Galus. Father always said that torture was just another tool, like a hammer or sword, and just like any other tool, it was to be used with caution. The 3 spies Galus had watched being tortured now stood before the High Court of Eklos. 2 of them were stout like a barrel, with windswept hair the colour of mud. The third was a bald man, built like a sapling, standing between the others like a peak jutting over the top of a valley. Like a peak jutting over the top of a valley. Okay. All 3 wore the same grey rags they were provided, with faces so mangled and eyes swollen to near shut. Galus wondered how they would even see. The tall one got the worst of it. His right hand was wrapped in blood-stained bandages where they had cut off 2 fingers, and his left knee was near useless. It was a feat in and of itself that they could stand, let alone speak. Yes, your lordship, the stout man on the right muttered. The court of 30-odd nobles chuckled and glanced at Galus's father on the dais to his left. We do not have lords here in Eklos. Surely your month spent spying on my kingdom would grant you that knowledge at the very least, his father smirked. You may address me as King Aradus, or better yet, not at all. Yes, the man stammered on before his father cut him off with a raised hand. And you, tall one, do you admit to your crimes? His father asked. Yes. The answer came at once through broken teeth and swollen cheeks. Gaelus's father rose to his feet, prompting all in attendance to rise. The sound of boots on stone echoed out across the court and into the open air. Of all the places in Thorndarus, the High Court was Gaelus's least favourite. It was said to have been built nearly a millennium ago atop Judge's Hill in pure grey stone, so as not to distract from the judgment within. Shaped like a horseshoe facing the blue moor sea, his father sat in the centre with Gaelus to his right and Gaelus's older sister Oriah to his left. Arcing out on either side were representatives from the 33 noble houses. The court was open to the elements no matter the season, so that the great stonemason could look down upon the court and judge. He shivered just thinking about the dozens of judgments he had attended in the middle of winter, the frigid salt air of the blue moor whirling around the court like an angry coarse spirit. But today was about as good of a day for court one could ask for. The intense heat of the day was fading as the evening sun made its trek towards the horizon, scattering its light across the moor. Besides, it wasn't every day you captured Adalesian spies. Alright, cool. That's as much as I care to read. So, my problem with this, it says, father always said the torture was just another tool, like a hammer or sword. Not a bad opening line. Not great, not bad. It's not bad. But it gave me a sense of like, alright, cool. So the author's got like a point of view established already about torture. At least there's going to be some exploration of this idea. What we get though is like immediately these guys have been like crippled into, they're broken, and that's fine. It just shows you the standard of this world and how brutal it can be. So that's fine as it is there. My main issue with what I've read so far is that the point of view is established as father always said that torture was another tool like a hammer or sword, and then after that we kind of go into this third person limited kind of narration, or like prose. And the issue with that is like, I thought I was going to be viewing things from someone's particular point of view, as in whoever this main character, the character's point of view we're reading from. It's Gaelus, is it? There's 3 spies Gaelus had watched being tortured now. So Gaelus, like I had to just reread it there to be sure that it was from Gaelus's point of view. And the problem is like, I'm not enough in his head and in his thoughts to like get enveloped into the story, which is how you've set it up from the initial line. The 3 spies Gaelus had watched being tortured now stood before the High Court of Eklos. 2 of them were stout like a barrel, with windswept hair the colour of mud. Like, who gives a shit about if they were stout like a barrel or if their hair was windswept the colour of mud? Like, I don't care. The 3rd was a bald man like a sapling. Again, who's Gaelus? Tell me who Gaelus is first. Because now you're introducing the imagery of these characters. It's already too much too soon. You could literally just say there were 3 men held captive who had been tortured, right? Immediately that gives me most of the information I need, but I need it from Gaelus's point of view if you're going to give it properly. Because right now it's almost like, I don't know, it's uncertain, the point of view, and it keeps shifting a little bit. The tall one got the worst of it. His right hand was right. Like, it's almost as if you want to write in first person, but then by not doing that, it's this like uncertain third person point of view. Yes, your lordship, the stout man uttered on the right muttered. And like, by the time you start having people talking, like I've found when I read these openings to stories, I kind of lose interest immediately when someone starts talking, because it's like you're signaling
to me, the reader, that okay, you have all the information you need, and now we're ready to start with the scene proper and have everyone start talking and have all the information. Like when you start putting information about the father says, "We do not have lords here in Eklos. Surely your months spent spying on my kingdom would grant you that knowledge at the very least." His father smirked. Like, you're already starting to bring in like world building and names of things and places we haven't heard before, and details and that kind of thing. But it's like, just imagine like a cloud of smoke, right? And like you're drifting in all these separate sentences of like, all three wore the same grey rags they were provided, with faces so mangled and eyes swollen to near shut. Galus wondered how they could even see. So it's like, okay, I get what you're trying to do. Like you're giving me the imagery of the captured men, and they're brutalized. But like Galus is literally as interesting as a wooden post. Like he's literally not even a cardboard cutout. Like I have nothing to imagine about what he looks like. How tall is he? How old is he? Vaguely, like he must be like 20. I'm guessing 20, in his 20s, because of his dad. Must be kind of young, I guess. Or I don't know how old his father is. Like you've already omitted and skipped over so many details about Galus that are crucial to get early on, because it's not like you could get away by not including those details right away. But the problem is that by the time the dialogue comes in, you've basically said, okay, now we're getting into the scene proper. Whereas specifically when you have chapter 1s, you really need to bide your time and make sure that you're using that time effectively to build up a train of thought, and you're building the context carefully, so that by the time the scene does start, the reader isn't overwhelmed by details. Because you want to have it where, like, you're always going to be revealing information, but when you do a chapter 1, you have to be really careful with making sure that the vantage points are decided properly, because we're with Galus, but we're not inside his head, and we have no sort of point of view looking at Galus, so we don't really learn anything about him from anyone else's point of view. And so you've basically created a blind spot where we have no idea who Galus is beyond what he perceives, and through the way you describe things, we don't even get like his actual in the moment thoughts more than his observations that read like third person limited, without any of Galus's like there's not even any hint at like an unreliable narrator, and so there's nowhere for me as the reader to get sort of my imagination stirred up, and sort of there's nothing to contrast, there's not much juxtaposition, there's no uncertainty within that will allow me to judge things for myself. It's all very like on the page as it is, and I think it's because the thing is that your writing's solid enough where you're not quite like George R. Martin prose level type thing, but like I feel like this is close to a professional enough kind of prose. But the problem is like the fundamentals of point of view, vantage point, what person you're writing in, sticking to it, needs to be figured out more before I could commit to reading more of this story and getting more involved into this world. But overall, it's okay. I just think those issues definitely need to be addressed. Okay, how long is that? So this one was Galus. It was, right? Yeah. It was called Rain of Stones. Rain of Stones. Gotta make sure I get the right timestamps. The Intern, Criminal Minds fanfiction. I'm good. Gaijin, fantasy. 7 out of 15 parts published. Blurb, a young apprentice sets off on a quest to prevent a terrible evil from invading the land. Does success await him at the end of his journey? It sounds a bit generic, I'll be honest. Fuck it, let's give it a try. Oh, it's quite a nice cover. The words on it need a bit of the font needs some work, but it's a nice cover. Table of contents, quest. I'm assuming this is the first part. They're not really numbered. Read. Quest, okay. Okay. The forest was quiet, but peaceful, not a sound to be heard. Not a bird's call or a breeze through the trees. That is how Gaijin knew that something was wrong. They, that is Gaijin and the other magicians that made up their company, had been travelling through this forest on horseback for the past 3 days, and in that time they had not seen any sign or any other living thing, not a bird or squirrel or even an insect. They had all fled this place. Gaijin drew his cloak tighter around his shoulders, but it did not dispel the creeping gloom that hung over this place. Something was terribly, horribly wrong. He could feel it in the air. He thought he could smell it too. It was just wrong. Very, very wrong. Ahead of him he could see the long line of horses carrying 20 or so of his fellow magicians, or should he say they were full magicians. He was only an apprentice, but he had been assigned to this quest. This quest had been brought to him into this place that made his skin crawl and made him want to turn back. But he couldn't show his fear. He had to show the others that it wasn't a mistake to take a second-class apprentice. He knew that the majority of his companions thought he was too inexperienced for something like this, that he wasn't ready, but Mage Unda had personally granted his approval, so they had to deal with it, and there really was no time for arguments. Mage Unda had called a meeting of the magicians, which had not been done in the lifetime of anyone now living. The meeting concerned strange premonitions the mage had. They were of destruction, of something powerful that had entered this world, which could prove the annihilation of everything. He told the magicians gathered that there was no more information except that he knew where this power would appear. He recommended that a company be formed to travel to this place and try to contain this power and change the fate of this world. Some protested, saying that if the premonitions were really that strong, then there was nothing to be done, and they should just accept it. Others shouted these down, saying they were just not yet ready to die. So the company was formed of those that volunteered, and those that were volunteered, like Gaijin, he had felt immensely inadequate. He thought that there would have been enough opposition to him going, though he wouldn't have to, but Mage Unda had personally approved, and that was that. Gaijin still didn't quite understand why his mentor Aish had volunteered him, but he trusted his mentor's judgment. This was a test of his abilities, and he wanted to make Aish proud. Alright. Aish. I don't know how to pronounce that. So I'm stopping here. Okay, so I actually think there's some interesting aspects to this story. I think this was a big mistake. All this big info dump. Alright? I don't give a shit about any of that. Because okay, when I'm reading a fantasy story, I don't give a shit whether it's the end of the world. I don't care about the stakes immediately, because when people read fantasy stories, what they typically want is to get engrossed into the world and the events that are happening. But if you info dump everything immediately, and have it so that, you know, you're explaining why everyone's here and all that, like, it just shows that you're not confident as a writer to basically set the scene and allow it to engross me first, and then you can include these details through dialogue, or seeing as it's just the beginning of the story, just omit all this backstory stuff entirely and just have us in the moment. And as your character meets challenges and obstacles, we're gonna learn about these things anyway eventually. So hold on, don't rush, don't put all this stuff in immediately, because I quite liked where is it? And in that time they had not seen any sign of any other living thing, not a bird or squirrel or even an insect. They had all fled this place. Gaijan drew his cloak tighter around his shoulders, but it did not dispel the creeping gloom that hung over this place. Something was terribly, horribly wrong. He could feel it in the air. Like, some of the writing is like very, very, that's not good. Terribly, horribly is not good. Like, that's just not good writing. It was just ... That's not good writing, because you're just creating tension that isn't actually there. But this image that you've created of these traveling magicians and this like forest without any living things in it, that's really cool. I like that. I wanted to keep reading to find out how that was going to get developed, because I felt the atmosphere of that was really nice. What let me down was that you immediately sort of like go off into this big tangent that is just almost feels like it's got nothing to do with what you initially set up, and so it was just really boring to read all this crap. You know, I think if you dragged like this whole beginning bit, if you made that like a whole page worth of like really engrossing prose where you really get us into the atmosphere of this forest without any living things, and what these traveling magicians look like how do they walk, what kind of bearing do they have, you know, are they all men, is there women mixed in there, you know, like what's the average age of these magicians, what time of day is it in terms of like what kind of lighting is there, you know, like really build an evocative sense of mood and atmosphere, because you've done it on a very micro level, and so that tells me that you can expand on that and really build that muscle. But it's missing right now, because you immediately went off into like trying to explain everything, so you can then come back to the situation with feeling like your reader's up to date with what you need to get across. But what is important is that we understand where your character is at emotionally, and you set that up to a certain degree. He's unsettled, he's nervous because of what's going on in the forest, and he's a younger character, so we know we're in a kind of coming of age type story. That's all we really need to know in the beginning to get engrossed, and then once you let out some like exciting events occur, then from there we can really start to like build the world and stuff. But think of it this way: you've named Gaijan, right? When you name Gaijan, that means you have, you know, basically just build him up first. Make sure that when you name a character, that you take the time to make sure we understand who they are to a degree where we're like, okay, next time, anytime Gaijan is mentioned, we know who we're dealing with. So that by the time you start mentioning Mage Unda, then we're not going to be like, whoa, fuck, I don't know, I'm just trying to learn about Gaijan, let alone Mage Unda and his backstory. Because every time you tell a character, every character has got like potentially a really interesting backstory that takes a lot of investment for the reader to get involved with. But you can't ask someone to get involved with two characters and their backstories whilst you're introducing them at the same time. There's just too much for the reader to take in at once, and so automatically they just disconnect. because it's just too much information, too fast. So that's my feedback there. But I think there's some interesting stuff. I just think that on a fundamental level, this needs to be rethought in terms of how you deliver information. I think as much as I think George R. Martin has his issues as a writer, one thing I'd say that he does pretty well is he sets the stage of his scenes really well. Like, especially in the first book of Game of Thrones. Where like they slowly discover the dire wolf pups, and like it never feels rushed, and it's such a simple, quiet scene, and then you've got like someone gets like their head cut off and stuff. Like it, he gives information, but he does it at a measured pace where you get a sense of mood and character and feeling, instead of a big narrative info dump like this. Okay, bear with me 1 second. Okay, so that was Gaijin. Pieces, allegory, word count. Come on, that word count's so tiny. Is there any point? Short ship. Oh, I did that one. The Last Philosopher. Subtitle, Nothing is Everything. Genre, fantasy / attempted comedy. Word count. The whole novel stands at 110k right now, but it's separated in parts of around 1k words. Read as much or as little as you want. Feedback type. I will accept any kind of feedback you want to give. Where is it linked? Where's the link? Am I not seeing it? He must have forgotten the link. I don't see it. The Black Veil, Rise of Darkness. Where's my tea break? There we go. Bear with me 1 more second. I'll be right back. Let me put my tea break on. I'll be right back. Okay, back. Okay. The Black Veil, the Rise of Darkness. Forward. Rain slowly drizzles down the foggy window. It is just a few hours until dawn. A short, podgy man is bound and gagged, tied down to a wooden chair. He squirms slightly against his bindings, trying to get loose, but cannot. He hears the floor creak behind him as a tall, pale, blonde-headed man in a solid black suit strides purposely towards him. "Hello, my short little friend. I apologize that you have unwittingly fallen into this little ceremony this evening. It is most unfortunate for you, but the fate has willed you to meet me again. To meet me tonight." His voice is high-pitched, cold, calloused. "You must undoubtedly be wondered why I have kidnapped you and brought you to this barn on this stormy, rainy night. Allow me to have the manners at least to illuminate this for you. You live in a much larger world than you have imagined, a world of magic, otherworldly dimensions, and a world filled with ignorant, mindless beings such as yourself. I and I alone have cracked into the mysterious of these many worlds, and tonight and I alone go farther to become immortal than any man before me." Here he pauses, and the chubby little man has tears sliding gently down his fear-etched face. "Today we see if we can settle old scores. Today we tap into ancient magic and set about bringing in a new order." The young man walks in front of the pudgy man and squats down to eye level. He has handsome features the man can see, sharp chiselled chin, pale blue eyes and blonde hair. He inclines his head to one side and examines the pudgy man for a moment curiously, and then swiftly stands up. He reaches out and pulls the gag from the short man's mouth. "Do you have any family?" he coldly quips. Yes," the man whispers. "A wife and 3 kids." The tall man swiftly shoves the gag back in. "That's a pity," he says remorselessly, "for you shall not see them again. But rejoice, my little friend, your sacrifice will fight many wrongs." And with these words he pulls out of his jacket pocket an ancient-looking dagger covered in faded Egyptian hieroglyphics. The short man squirms more violently, and terrified, muffled screams escape from his gag. "Shh! Now is not the time for fear. Now is the time for rejoicing," says the tall man, and he plunges the dagger into the pudgy man's heart, and his screaming swiftly ends. Okie dokie. So my major issue with this is that, one, it reads like a film script, because everything is on the surface level of detail. And I'm neither situated with the pudgy man, I'm neither situated with the chiselled, calloused man. And so I've got nothing to tether me emotionally to the story. Now, if you were to rewrite this, but focus more on the absolute sheer terror and panic. Did I take off my tea break sign? Yeah, I did. The sheer terror and panic that this man would feel tied up and gagged. You know, like how does it feel in the chair, like that he's tied up in? Are his bindings tight? Are they loose? Could he potentially escape? Is there any hope? If he dies, who is he going to leave behind? How does he feel about that? How did he end up in this situation? If you want to keep loads of the details, what would you say, like, omitted from the reader, like you don't want to give too much away about who's who and that kind of thing, then ask yourself, like, why is the pudgy little man important? If he's of no importance ultimately, you still don't really lose anything from building up his personal history as a character and his backstory, because I wouldn't want to read any more of this story, because I feel like, if this pudgy little man is an example of how you set up characters and then kill them off, it's like, then what's the point? Like, why would I get engrossed in the story? Because there's not even like a tangible sense of mood. It's all promise, and I appreciate that you're saying, okay, here's the initial prologue to capture your attention before we get into chapter 1. But the problem is like, you're telling me all this stuff, but, you know, if we're getting down to business and we're just like, look, I just imagine you're that the chubby little man in the chair, right? And you're tied up in a chair, you're gagged, you're probably going to die. Some guy's being absolutely mental and crazy before you with a knife with Egyptian hieroglyphics on it. Like, if all of that is going on, there's so much detail and tension that is worthy of so much more than just this amount of writing, right? Like, that is really not enough time and words to get across the sheer panic and terror of that situation. And so as a consequence, it feels very underwritten and very rushed. But I mean, the story of it is fine, I guess. It's quite generic. You know, we're talking about dimensions. Like, the main problem is that you can talk about dimensions and Egyptian daggers and a callous man and all this kind of stuff, but it's only interesting if you make it interesting. You know, it's like, what do I care about dimensions in a world where, you know, all I really know about a character is that he's a chubby little man? Like, you know, all you've really done is set a contrast between the chubby little man and the tall, I think, is he handsome or blue-eyed or something? Like, you've set some kind of contrast, but it's nothing. There's nothing for me to hold on to as a reader to make me want to keep reading and keep going with the story. That's just what I think so far. Yeah, so I think you really need to learn how to create moments within moments. You know, like, you really need to capture into, like, the senses. You know, how awake is he? How much pain is he in? You know, is he hungry? Is he what can he hear? Where are, like, you know, there's so many details that you're missing out on that could make this scene really interesting. And so things are just left vague and uninteresting as a consequence, in my opinion. 138. What's this one called? The Black Veil, The Rise of Darkness. And I finished this one approximately 1 minute 38, 138 minutes in. Cool. Hendru Minmin, action adventure. Part is the finished first chapter. Another is a scene I had floated in my head for a while that I wanted to start drafting. Cool. Can I get rid of that on the side? Yeah. There we go. I think you guys can... I want to make sure those are turned off. There we go. So you guys can see that, alright? Cool. Hendru rewrite. Chapter 1. Hendru laid in bed, his sweat-soaked pillow sloshing as he tried to get into a more comfortable position. Sloshing is definitely not a good choice of words there. It's just not. Pillows that are even sweat-soaked don't slosh. As he awoke, he sat up violently, his head crashing through the bunk above him. Scattering wood splinters across the floor. A scream escaped his body as he grabbed the sides of his head to calm himself. "Would you shut up?" asked his brother Hendrik, who sat at the bedside table. His head crashing through the bunk above him. How does a head crash through the bunk above him? That doesn't make sense. I had another one of those dreams that keep coming back to me. Somebody laid beside me, comforting me in their warmth, but every time they left before I could fall asleep. Hendrik said nothing and stared out the window, focused more on the buildings in the distance than anything his brother had to say. What buildings? What do they look like? Tears started to form in the corners of his eyes, but Hendrik stopped them before they flowed, lest his brother go on about how he needed to grow up. "Get dressed, we're leaving in 10 minutes," said his brother as he went down the stairs. Hendry nodded and stood up, nearly scraping the ceiling with his head. What? Despite being 6 years his junior, Hendry almost doubled Hendrick in both height and sheer size. He pulled on his brown cargo pants and strapped his suspenders over his white buttoned shirt. Hendry made his way down the stairs and took... Okay, I'm stopping. So, this just needs full-on rewrites. Because you have Hendry, right? I don't really understand who Hendry is. So, like, by the time you're having him leave the room, you're basically saying this initial scene's over, we're going into the next part, right? And so your time is up. Because you've named Hendry. I need to know who Hendry is before we move on. And I don't really have a grasp other than he like somehow like bats his head through a bed bunk, which is just reads a bit ridiculous. But like it can work, but it just the way you've written it doesn't make sense. And his brother's just sat at the bedside table. Hendring. And so now you've named another character. So like if you name a character, I expect at least a paragraph or two to like sum them up in a way in the moment of what they're doing, and just to get a vibe so that when you reference Hendry or Hendring, I know who you're talking about. I already feel like I have some indication of who they are and what they're like. But right now you've already jumped in. It's only like a few lines in. You've gone Hendry, Hendring, and then before you know it, he's starting talking about like the mystery of his dreams and stuff. Like it's too much too soon, basically. And you really need to space it out. And then you like Hendring said nothing and stared out of the window. What window? So they're in a bedroom, right? But what window? What does he see beyond the window? Focus more on the buildings in the distance, and like what buildings in the distance? What about them? What do they look like? What year is it? What design of the buildings? Like give me something about the buildings. Like why bring up the buildings if they're not in any way important to the scene? You know, do they reveal Hendring's Hendry's character? Do they reveal Hendring's character? Like what is Hendring doing at the bedside table? Like he's at the bedside table, but he's just sat there? Like is he writing? Is he reading? Like there's just so much information you've left out. Like there's really nothing to really examine or get engaged with in the story. Like the names are unusual as well, but I imagine that's like a cultural thing. You know, maybe I'd understand these names better if I was from like a different culture or something. That's my opinion on those. 143. Do. Chapter 1 of Dying Alone. Okay. No one can describe being dead, but I'll bet you 10 grand I can get close. Being dead is the same as being asleep, not the dreaming. I'm talking about the hard, black stupor of sleepwalkers, the timelessness behind your eyelids. When it started, it was like dreaming. Maybe I don't know what it's like to die yet, but I'll tell you what Alzheimer's is, and I'll tell it with sky is blue, earth is round, never ask a woman if she's pregnant certainty. Alzheimer's is the surreal part of sleep. You walk into a room but you don't know how you got there, and you don't think to wonder why until someone asks you to remember. Everyone talks to you in questions. The answers are on the tip of your tongue, but your tongue turns to cotton in your mouth. You only know that you have the answer right there, so close, like it's in your back pocket, and all you have to do is pull it out and everyone will see that you're still you. Then you reach for the pocket and pull out a tuft of lint, Alzheimer's is that feeling of profound unbelonging every moment, every day, until you slip into a coma and die. Doctors said that's how it happens for everyone. Everyone until me. Medical miracle or not, it's almost a disappointment. Not that I wanted to die, not with this 60-odd year lucky streak I have going, but if I had to die, I was hell-bent on sticking the landing. Alzheimer's is a slow way to go, and there's mercy in that. I had time to plan everything. Irrevocable trusts, donations to charity, a legacy for my children, an 8-digit nest egg for my wife. What my daughter affectionately calls Ray Danning money has its uses. I even got to pick my own gravestone, Rock of Ages granite and a Celtic cross. Charity, family, legacy. The world I left behind was secure. After one Christmas night, I got a hug from everyone and fell asleep with a thought swimming in my head. Wouldn't it have been great if that was it? Dying, surrounded by loved ones? But I didn't die. My memory left me, I fell into the coma, and now even that's gone. So is the life I thought I'd built. But after everything that's happened since, the habit is still there, tickling me, itching like an unanswered question. It wonders if I was right. It wonders if I should have gone when I had the chance. Mwah. It was 9. What is it with these introductory chapters from amateur writers who always have their characters waking up? Please, I beg you, please stop having your characters waking up from consciousness. It's the worst thing to do ever, please. The sweet irony of it as well is I'm guilty of it in my own writing, like really badly. But it is what it is. It was 9:59 a.m. when I woke from the coma on the dot. To be fair, he did wake from a coma. So he's not exactly waking from bed. So, I mean, it does have a kind of like central plot point, to be fair. That was the first thing I saw. A hostel clock with its big elementary school digits, the second hand marking the minute. I looked around. My hospital room was broad and flat and smelled of cucumber hand sanitizer. That's a very vivid bit of writing. I like that. Someone familiar was napping in a chair, an open book resting on her chest. Rain was worming down the window, and the world beyond it was mossy and Kelly green. Spring? That felt new. I drew a breath and sat up, wondering where it had come from. Not yet wondering where I was or when I was, but who had whispered "moi" in my ear. I blinked. The old guy moan had come out of me. There was still a me. As I sat staring at the clock, wondering what dimension I'd landed in, a nurse with the deepest dimples I'd ever seen walked in to drop off a clipboard. Her head jerked. Mr. Danning? How? I chewed. My tongue felt like lead. How long? My God. Oh my God, she dropped the clipboard and held my wrist. Mr. Danning, what's your first name? Ray. But how long was I out? Then the look she gave me was equal parts horror and astonishment, as if she'd delivered a baby who spoke fluent English. I was not supposed to be so clear. What had been a fever dream of doctors in good days and bad days and all the Alzheimer's cliches all washed away. Ray, my name is Ray. Somehow that felt like a big deal, just knowing. Nurse Dimples put me through some tests, light in my eyes, followed the finger, then had me lie down and told me to stay calm before running into the hallway, yelling, Ray Danning is awake, and he spoke. The woman in the chair gasped out of her nap, rubbed her fingertips at the bruisey bags under her eyes. Ray, her voice was familiar enough that I could tell she sounded hoarse. Someone I knew from childhood? God, Ray. I was about to ask who she was when Dimples came back with a small crowd of people in white coats. The questions swarmed. Did I know what day it was? Hell no. Where are you right now? The hospital? Or, this is the worst McDonald's drive-thru I've ever seen? That's not very good, I'll be honest. Well, who's the president? It's just too quaint and quirky, you know? Who's the president, Ray? I'm not sure, but he probably sucks. Okay? Again, it's just like quirky. One woman in a white coat took out a pad of paper and drew 3 objects for me to memorize, but she was a doctor, so the sketches had a cubist accuracy. Dimples knocked on my knee and my foot kicked up. my wiring still worked. The napping woman tried to poke her way through, saying something like, Hanji, but a doctor ushered her out to give me space. A few minutes later, Dr. Picasso asked me to remember the object she drew. Hammer, surfboard, book, I said. The room went quiet. Was I right? I knew I was right. I just wanted somebody else to say it to confirm my sanity, to shake me and say, no, this isn't a dream, this is a miracle. Yes, Dr. Picasso said. I'm at a loss here. Anyone? They shook their heads. Before the coma, he didn't even know his name. She moved her lips at another doctor. What the hell? Hey, I said. Alzheimer's, not blind. They looked at me with their eyes gone big. I could read that thought. Not only is Lazarus back from the dead, but he's got jokes. Before the coma, I said, how long was I out? Why don't you just relax a while? I wiggled my pinky at her, showing the clip of the heart rate monitor. They had a catheter in me too. I could feel the fire burning in my urethra and the simultaneous urge to piss the fire out, but I knew the better than to wiggle that at them. I think I'm rested. Can you tell me how long I was out? Where's Rusty Brabeck? Alright, that's cool. I think that's as much as I think I need to read. I'm interested in the scenario, at least. So it's an interesting enough scenario. I think the choice to use an intro was probably a good one. To set up that he had Alzheimer's and everything, because that really nicely helps to avoid any confusion once he actually wakes up. So that was a good. I think that was a good thing to do. I think what this lacks is in the moments, like when he first wakes up, you capture some really nice elements. Like where was it? The best line I think was, my hostel room was broad and flat and smelled of cucumber hand sanitizer. Right, I was very evocative for some reason. But I think, you know, when you're in like a hostel room, you imagine like the quietness of it, the beeping machines. You know, you're in a place of death, which is obviously has its own and life, but it's like it has its own ominous connotations. You know, the whole thing of him having like a catheter in, like that, I feel like you can establish all of the physical intricacies of his situation more immediately, because I felt like you kept skipping over things. Like before you know it, there's like people coming in the room and you were giving them like quirky names, which is okay, I guess. But the problem is like it feels like you're giving them quick quirky names to avoid actually taking the time to fill out these characters, the nurse, the doctors, the person waiting in the chair. Like, just take your time and like really, because like I feel like each sentence is jumping ahead when it doesn't quite work. Also, because right now it's like you're telling the story as if it's already happened, but at the same time you're telling it in the moment. As in, I sat staring at the clock, wondering what dimension I'd landed in. But it's like, that's fine, but why are you telling me this? Why, like, from what point of view are you telling me this? If it's from in the moment, then why not just tell the story in the moment for the character? You know, why do it past tense? I think it is. So I think that you're sort of dipping into different tenses, and not too badly, just to the point where I'd say my other thing is like it's competently written, but at the same time it also feels kind of lazily written. Like, I drew a breath and sat up, wondering where it had come from. Not yet wondering where I was or when I was, but who had whispered moi in my ear. Like, it reads like you don't really care about the presentation of the writing. Like, it's definitely not, like, published book quality, you know? Like, especially with all these lines here, this kind of stuff. I don't know. The presentation isn't very good. This looks, it just, when you get like blocks of writing, it just feels a little bit like loose, and maybe you could make better use of your word consistency and quality. I don't know. I get this idea that you're actually like you could do a lot better than you are doing. Like I feel like there's a level of detail that you could achieve, but for whatever reason you're being content to like write at a lower level of quality than you otherwise could. Yeah, so I feel like you just really need to up your game and commit yourself to really filling out these moments and letting the story really breathe and take its time. Because I think you've actually got kind of an interesting scenario building up here. I think this is a bit lame. The sky is blue, earth is round, never ask a woman if she's pregnant, certainty. It's like, that's such a jumble thought to read and listen to. Like, when I mean listen to, I mean like I'm listening to it in my own head kind of thing. I don't know. Your protagonist is a little bit quirky in an uninteresting, generic way, which maybe you want to focus on. Like he's 60 years old, and I feel like he's talking like a 20-year-old in his head, you know? And there's no real hallmarks of his age. Like, isn't there references that a 60-year-old would use instead of a 20-year-old? Just something to think about. But overall, it's alright. It's decent. Okay, that brings me up to about 2 hours, so I think there hasn't been any people in the chat today, which is fine. But let's have a look. So that was 1 hour 57 minutes. I'll stop doing that one. And what was this one called? Chapter 1 of Dying Alone. Cool. Right, so I might stream later, I might not, we'll see. But there's 9 short stories, excerpts that I've read and gave my thoughts on, that I'll get in contact with these people and let them know that I've done this. Yep, so cool. Till next time, guys. Bye bye.